Welcome to the webinar, Civil Society Perspectives on CORSIA. Thanks a lot for the huge interest. We believe it's really the right time to start discussing CORSIA again, since the next ICAO Assembly is going to take place in the end of September. And we are very much looking forward to this webinar with interesting inputs from different experts and with a discussion with all of you. My name is Mira Kapfinger, and I'm one of the co-founders of Stay Grounded, a network to counter aviation and to build a just transport system. We have more than 200 organizations that back our positions globally, and more than 130 active member organizations. And critiquing the greenwashing attempts of the aviation industries is one of our core work. So I will hand over to Magdalena Heuwieser, who is also Stay Grounded co-founder and campaigner at Stay Grounded, for a short introduction into the topic.
Yes, so yeah, great that we have so many participants in this webinar, also people from very diverse backgrounds, from NGOs, from social movements, from journalists, and people more involved also in the CORSIA process. So I'm really looking forward also to the discussion and to your opinions. So today we'll be talking about CORSIA, a program that was adopted in 2016 by the ICAO, the International Civil Aviation Organization, in order to address the international carbon emissions from aviation. CORSIA stands for Carbon Offsetting and Reduction Scheme for International Aviation, and the R from reduction was actually only afterwards included, so it's also very misleading. The goal was not really to reduce emissions, but to achieve a so-called carbon neutral growth, which is also very questionable. So with CORSIA, the ICAO proclaimed the global aspirational goal of keeping the global net carbon emissions from international aviation from 2020 at the same level, so not to reduce. And when having a closer look at what the ICAO means with this, it is even clearer that this program is far from ambitious, and that the huge power the aviation industry has inside this UN body has shown its effects. So the proclaimed carbon neutral growth is supposed to be achieved mostly by offsetting, so by the compensation of emissions through projects that are mostly located in the global south, like hydroelectric dams or forest plantations. And you might have seen our study, The Illusion of Green Flying, that you can find in several languages on our website, where we explain what's the problem with CORSIA and with offsetting. Just shortly now to resume the main issues involved with offsetting. First, it diverts the attention from the urgent need to not shift, but to reduce emissions at the source. Second, it is the opposite to climate justice. It is very unjust, actually, that a small elite of frequent flyers want to continue with their lifestyle, while others in the global south need to fix the damage. For example, women in Africa using cleaner cooking stoves, or indigenous peoples being restricted to use wood from their ancestral forest. And actually, it's true that many offset projects lead to land grabbing, especially forest and land-based projects like REDD+. And only 2% of the UN compensation projects, the CDM, Clean Development Mechanism, have a high probability to be additional, so to really compensate emissions, and the same is the case with most of the offset projects. We'll later on hear more about the criteria that are discussed for offset credits for CORSIA, and what will be discussed about this in the next meeting taking place in Montreal from the 24th of September to the 4th of October. So thank you, Gilles Dufresne from Carbon Market Watch, for giving an input on this topic. We hope that your internet connection will continue to work. Yes, and then part of the CORSIA deal is also to push the use of the so-called sustainable alternative fuels. And Almut Ernstling and Rachel Smolka from Biofuel Watch will give an input about the danger involved with this push for other fuels, especially biofuels. Also, this strategy is totally opposite to climate justice. So CORSIA is not only not ambitious enough in our opinion, but it could actually be harmful. Also because CORSIA could limit the possibilities for countries and regions to implement stronger measures to reduce aviation, like kerosene tax, like limits on short-haul flights, like the push for alternatives of night trains, etc. For several reasons, it is therefore very necessary to strongly oppose this greenwashed program, CORSIA. And maybe something which is interesting, the date of the launch of CORSIA in October 2016 was actually also the birth for Stay Grounded, with the first coordinated actions taking place at airports and in Montreal simultaneously during the conference. So it is, yes, the Stay Grounded network is also very connected with the resistance towards CORSIA. And talking about Montreal and resistance on the ground, we are also very happy to welcome Anthony Garofallis-Auger from the Rapid Decarbonization Group based in Montreal, who will tell us what their plans are during the conference. And we'll then have time to discuss further possible civil society strategies to counter CORSIA. And of course, in between, there's also time to ask questions after each presentation. Okay, so I hand over to Mira again.
Okay, thank you very much, Lena. So the first input will come from Almut Ernstling from Biofuel Watch, which is an European and US-based NGO working to raise the awareness of the negative impacts on biofuels. And Almut is based in the UK. Thank you very much for joining us. And her colleague Rachel will stay later on for the discussion, since Almut needs to leave us during the webinar.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, I think I can kind of start. I mean, just to say, in terms of Biofuel Watch, we started looking at CORSIA probably a couple of years ago, when we realized that there was a really, really high risk of this scheme becoming the main driver for a new market, for potentially very big new market for biofuels. Back in 2017, there'd been a proposal to the ICAO Secretariat had actually proposed having biofuel targets rising up to an absolutely gigantic 50% of aviation fuel, and that's, you know, aviation fuel use expanding along the lines of 5% every year. That was stopped, but you know, we then realized that although the actual targets weren't endorsed by the member states of ICAO, there is still, you know, a really, really big danger that we could see a big new market for biofuels. Sorry. Yes, let me start. So I've done a little bit of an overview. So I think the first few slides are a bit duplicating what's been said already. Can we have the next one?
Sure.
Okay, so a little bit of where, again, to remember where CORSIA comes from before we get onto the biofuels aspects. So basically, under the Kyoto Protocol, the aviation shipping industry didn't have any commitments to reduce the international shipping had no commitments whatsoever. The industry, it's one of the fastest growing causes of greenhouse gas emissions. The growth, overall aviation growth or fuel growth is about 5% internationally every year. So, this is from in Transport Environment graph of how, emissions are forecast to, have been, forecast to keep growing really rapidly. And under the Paris Agreement, it wasn't really clear to the industry that they would have the same get-out clause, because we now have this overall aim of stabilizing warming at well below 2 degrees. And if possible 1.5 degrees, and current aviation emissions are expected to use up 27% of the total carbon budget that's calculated for 1.5 degrees of warming by 2050 alone. So next one. So that's the dilemma. How could they keep up their emissions growth under the Paris Agreement goals? Next one. Now, no way they could do it through efficiency improvement. So again, Transport Environment slide, you can see the two darker green. This is how the emissions going up. The two darker green bars are for efficiency, operational and airplane efficiency. That's really a drop in the ocean, even if they want to stabilize, let alone reduce emissions. And stabilized emissions is what you see in the red and white. So they're not going to get very far with that. Even those having said that, they can and should do a lot better than they have been, but it's still not going to do, go anywhere near enough even stabilizing emissions with current growth rates, let alone reduce. Down, please. Okay, so to the aid of the aviation industry to solve the conundrum, ICAO, which is a specialist UN organization, which is really more or less acting as an industry, as an organ of the industry. You'll hear more about the non-transparency of ICAO later from somebody else. So to solve the conundrum, basically CORSIA got created. And it got created with the aim to keep emissions stable at the levels they will be in 2020, not to reduce them. And not very easy to see in the slides on the small screen, but basically what you have is, this is the forecast by one of the participants, German aviation industry, and showing really the green is forecast to come from alternative fuels, then this and the gray from carbon offsetting. So increasingly largely through alternative fuels, but also big growth offsets. Next one, please. So first of all, a bit about offsetting, and yeah, we've got somebody else speaking about this now. So I just thought I had a look at a recent Red Monitor article by Chris Lang, who sort of listed all the different schemes that have applied for accreditation under CORSIA. So there hasn't been a decision about which ones will be accredited, and there's still, anyway, you'll hear more about the current state, but they are all projects within some of the three different schemes that have applied, and you can see, how really worrying this is in terms of, I've picked out forest and tree plantation related ones that are all bidding, wanting to bid under CORSIA. From acacia monocultures in the legal Amazon region to a really weird proposal by the Polish government, very notorious for its forest destruction and ancient forest destruction recent years, wanting to get carbon credits for planting new trees on the clear-cut land, and for actually wanting carbon credits for cutting down trees even faster at a younger age. Couldn't make it up. And then there's one one project that involved a really, really controversial plantation scheme in Uganda involving, quite serious human rights abuses. So, potential really, really big worry of what the carbon offsetting will mean, not just in terms of greenwashing, but in terms of real impacts on lands, on communities, on forest-dependent peoples and small farmers, and on forest and biodiversity. Next one, please. Now onto biofuels. So I finally had a read of the criteria. Some of basically most that's published. There's a lot more published in the recent weeks by CORSIA. Very nicely, after we've been warning for 2 years that CORSIA would likely involve palm oil biofuels, CORSIA actually nicely admits that now, quite openly, quite blatantly in their graphic. If you can see the eligible feedstocks from their frequently asked questions, and you've got soybean oil and palm oil, crude palm oil, as well as something they call a residue, palm fatty acid distillate, really listed as eligible feedstocks. So I had a closer look at, which is really bearing out all the concerns and all the fears we had, showing that they have been absolutely justified. Now, I had a closer look at how they are going to account for greenhouse gas savings. Now, to go back a little step. So under CORSIA, any eligible fuels and sustainable alternative aviation fuels have to meet 2 criteria. One is they must be classed as having 10% less greenhouse gas emissions than the average fossil fuel emissions from burning kerosene. And secondly, they must, in the case of biofuels, and we're getting onto the non-biofuel stuff at the end. In the case of biofuels, they should not come from the conversion of carbon-rich ecosystems after 2008, right? So exactly how the latter is going to be proven, the proposals have not yet been published, and we fear that they will be absolutely as weak as anything and an invitation to fraud. But what has now been published is the first part of the methodology for deciding which feedstocks meet the greenhouse gas criteria. And what they are saying is that palm oil from palm mills where methane is captured deliver 14% greenhouse gas savings. So we now know that a huge proportion of crude palm oil will be classified as being low carbon enough to qualify under CORSIA. We also know, and I get onto that from that a fraction of crude palm oil, which is falsely classified as a residue, is classified as having at least 77% greenhouse gas savings. There will be an additional methodology that is not publicly yet, and we believe that the additional one will allow airlines to claim even bigger greenhouse gas savings and to possibly allow palm oil without methane capture to also be classified as meeting the standards. But those will be published after the assembly in September. But this is already out, so it's already pretty much as bad news as any of us had ever feared. Next, please. Now compare the claims of greenhouse gas savings from palm oil with the findings of a study commissioned by the European Commission. Scientific study. What that study actually showed is that crude palm oil has 3 times greater greenhouse gas emissions when you take indirect land use change into account than the fossil fuels it replaces. Using the same methodology, this spuriously, falsely labeled rare palm oil residue actually is 224% of the emissions of fossil fuels. So it's still over twice as bad. Yet CORSIA classifies it as having 77% less greenhouse gas emissions. So it's completely, what CORSIA says, bears no resemblance to any science. These are completely political figures. Next, please. Okay, why can we expect that large-scale aviation biofuels will come primarily from palm oil? Oops, I think there's a little bit cut off on that slide. Never mind. Hang on. Yeah, never mind. So basically right now, airlines are trying to avoid palm oil where they can, have so far managed to avoid it because it sounds really bad. You know, it's really not good for their reputation. However, in terms of technology, airplanes can only fly with certain types of biofuels that are chemically more or less identical to the fossil fuel hydrocarbons. There are different technologies for making them. 5 different pathways have been approved, but only one of them is commercially proven. The one that's commercially proven is are biofuels based on hydrotreated vegetable oil, or HVO. Nothing else is really properly working except on a tiny laboratory scale for the odd little test flight. And you know, this is a picture of one of the biggest HVO refineries in the world, by Neste Oil, the world's biggest HVO producer. They rely, certainly this is a Singapore refinery, relies primarily on palm oil and palm oil products. Next, please. Now, the reason for that, the reason why palm oil is really the favorite of palm oil products, you know, the top HVO feedstock are twofold. Firstly, palm oil is the cheapest of all potential feedstocks that are available in large supply. Yes, you can get used cooking oil and tallow, and airlines are using that at the moment. And but there's only so much of that. The you know, supplies of tallow and used cooking oil cannot be increased, or not. You know, can vary to very small extent only. So if you want large scale, this palm oil is by far the cheapest. And of the large scale ones, it's the cheapest to buy. It is also the cheapest to refine. It uses less hydrogen. It is really an absolutely ideal fuel for making HVO. Totally the opposite of biodiesel, but absolutely for HVO, for the type of fuel that aircraft need. Next, please. Yeah, so therefore Neste is now ramping up this year, starting to ramp up its aviation biofuel production in Singapore, based in the heartland of the palm oil industry, you know, wedged between Malaysia and Indonesia, and other producers are waiting in the wings. And this is in the context of the EU having decided to slowly, way too slowly, but eventually phase out most palm oil biofuels, and for road transport under its Renewable Energy Directive. So looking here, Total just opened this year a huge, mainly palm oil HVO refinery in the north of France. The French government has decided to withdraw the tax rebates on which the Seoul refinery relies. You know, really high chance they'll have to shut down. And those refiners will be looking to CORSIA as a lifeline for staying open and for continuing their expansion based on palm oil. Next, please. Very briefly, yeah, PFAD, as I mentioned, you know, be very, very wary of this so-called waste. So Neste Oil claims that over 70% of its biofuels are not from palm oil, they're made from waste, but the majority of their waste, we believe, they won't disclose anything, but we believe, is PFAD. It is simply a fraction of crude palm oil. It's not some sort of residue made from palm shells or something like that. It is a product that is in very high demand. It is never wasted. It's fully used. And also, if the demand for PFAD goes up compared to crude palm oil, they can simply turn more crude palm oil into PFAD. It's really, really easy. So it really is not much different from other types of palm oil. So it's, yeah, I mean, just be really aware that's the greenwashing trick of the industry to get palm oil in the first instance. Next, please. What happened to that one? Oh no, next, sorry, I got that wrong. Okay, there we go. Oops. So now, to make things even more incredible, you can even have fossil fuels that are eligible alternative aviation fuels. So that went through in 2018, last year, a rule that fossil fuel kerosene that comes with 10% less greenhouse gas emissions than the average fossil fuels can also count towards CORSIA targets. And we imagine, I mean, the methodology hasn't been published, but we imagine that this will involve oil from refineries powered with so-called renewable energy, genuinely renewable, or simply bioenergy, which, regardless of how high carbon it really is, or it might even involve oil from new oil wells because they take a lot less energy to extract and refine. Next, please. So on the final slide, we therefore, really think it's really vital that CORSIA can't be reformed. It must be stopped. I mean, first, it can't be reformed because, as you'll hear later, ICAO is a totally non-transparent pro-industry organization. There are really no credible ways for civil society to substantially reform CORSIA, and groups have really, really tried that. It's not, there's really no leverage. Secondly, even if some of the most shocking CORSIA proposals and rules were changed, it's still a vehicle for facilitating unending aviation growth, and which would make it impossible for us to avoid the very worst impacts of climate change. We believe that really the way to stop CORSIA is to persuade member states, i.e. all our separate governments, to reject CORSIA and to not opt into the voluntary. So there's a voluntary phase starting next year, and to say, we refuse to be part of the scheme and we refuse to be part of it altogether. We understand there's a reasonable chance they can still leave and opt out. And we need to convince them of that. And of course, at the same time, to keep up the pressure for them to take real measures to reverse the aviation growth. Okay, that's me.
Thank you so much, Almut, for this great overview and quite shocking insight into what the so-called solutions that are on the table at CORSIA actually entail, especially in the case of biofuels. We have also already received a comment by Jeff Lewis from the US, who said that your slides are really excellent, and he asked if you would be willing to share them with us.
Sure.
Okay, wonderful. And thank you so much. So for the bigger discussion, we will wait until we have heard the input from Gilles too. But in case there are specific questions right now, just content-wise, where you had an issue with understanding, just direct questions, we can have a few minutes for this. So Mathieu Thomas from France is asking, is it Neste oil or is it Neste oil?
Neste.
Neste.
Just
okay.
Neste. I don't really use the oil, but it used to be Neste oil. It's not now just Neste. It's a company majority owned by the Finnish government.
Okay, thanks a lot. And I would suggest to now dive into this input from Anthony, who will tell us more about what is actually happening on the civil society side during the ICAO Assembly in Montreal. And then we still have time to delve into the discussions on what other possibilities there would be to get active and what maybe some of you have already planned. So because we have lots of people from different organizations joining this webinar, so it's really great to just share and learn from each other. And yeah, first of all, thank you, Anthony, for joining. Anthony is Executive Director of the Rapid Decarbonization Group. It's a climate policy advocacy and scientific communication nonprofit in Montreal. And they are also, as Biofuel Watch, also stay grounded members. Anthony, you're still muted. Yeah, now we can hear you.
Okay, yeah, and we recently joined the Stay Grounded Network, and we're happy to be part of the network. So maybe I can start off just with a bit of background on what Rapid Decarbonization Group is. So basically, it's a group of us that were working on climate change in university, and then we decided, well, let's create a professional organization so that we could advocate on climate policy and have a nonprofit that can take in money, etc. But we're longtime activists, and the work that we do is a bit behind the scenes and trying to kind of get to kind of do movement building, so help organizations get in contact, and then also like talk to them about the science and try to get them to be more ambitious in what they're demanding. So it's in the name, rapid decarbonization. Kind of what we're concerned about, what we're trying to redress is the fact that a lot of groups put forward reduction targets that are not ambitious enough in our opinion. So what we push for is something akin to a World War II scale economic mobilization. And because of that, we support groups like have similar demands. And just to let you know, it says it in my name as Rapid Decarbonization Group, but I'm also part of Extinction Rebellion Quebec. So I'll give a bit of context in the Quebec side, what's been happening. So on March 15th, there was a climate strike, a student climate strike. So it was global. In Quebec, about 150,000 people showed up. So it was actually the largest climate strike in the world. There are several factors that explain that, and I'm not going to get into the detail, but the mobilization in the province around climate change is quite impressive. And this, what we're doing right now around aviation, is kind of building off of that and building off that momentum. And it actually is working quite good. So yeah, you had the March 15th demonstration, then you had several more demonstrations around climate change. And you've had groups that are formed. So you have kind of a university group. It's called Planète s'invite à l'université. You have another civil society group made up of just professionals. That's just kind of not really an official structure, but has a pretty big capacity for mobilization, called La Planète s'invite au Parlement. And then you have Fridays for Future, Quebec branch, etc. And all of these have been behind this big mobilization. And at the same time, there's another group called La Pacte pour la Transition, which kind of came out with a statement for a bunch of celebrities not too long ago. And they actually managed to get about 290,000 people on our mailing list, which is a huge amount of people on a mailing list in a very, very short amount of time. And the people that are on the mailing list also signed up to a pact that said, like they want ambitious climate action, but they're going to take steps in their own lives, including reducing aviation, like, reducing the air flights that they take. So all of this is all happening at the same time. And kind of the idea for us was, well, we've been kind of interested in aviation for a while. We were at the assembly about 3 years ago with a very small protest, but we were in front of there with actually some state-grounded members. And we're like, all right, well, let's see if we can do something different this time around. And the idea was, well, let's try to create a coalition. So we created a document that basically just stated a few demands, and this kind of came, where we're like, well, what can we ask specifically from ICAO? Because ICAO is, headquartered in Montreal. We kind of have an opportunity to be there on the ground and to speak to media and to make a statement. And another factor that's in this is that there's actually an election, a federal election in October. And our Minister of Transport actually has his riding in Montreal as well. Marc Garneau, who is an astronaut, former astronaut, is our Minister of Transport. So what we decided to do is put together this document and just be like, all right, let's see if people are on board with the demands, demands that we have. So we realized that not all the groups have the same reduction targets. So not everyone is calling for zero emissions within 10 years like we are. But what we thought most people can agree on is that we need to reduce drastically and immediately air traffic. And we didn't want to say reduce emissions in the sector. We wanted to say reduce air traffic, because we felt that that gets the message across that what's really needed is a reduction in air traffic to get to a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. Had we put a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, then it kind of creates confusion, because the industry is going to say, well, we need carbon, we're putting forward carbon neutral growth. And we wanted to be very clear cut about what it was. What the specific measure was. So we have that as one point. And then the rest of it, the kind of goes in that direction, was, well, what we can call for is a frequent flyer levy. So tax that on frequent flyers. So, after the first flight, then you have a tax, and that tax multiplies by a certain factor every time, till it becomes so expensive after several flights that even the mega rich can't afford it. And then with that, we have Bombardier that's headquartered in Montreal. So Bombardier, it's actually changing their business model. We're going to focus more on luxury private jets. That was, that was a big announcement in Quebec. And also there was not much criticism of it. So we're deciding, well, let's come out against this, and actually let's just call for a halt in the construction of luxury private jets for Bombardier, and a just transition for the aviation sector in the province to go towards building high-speed rail and more local public transit, because Bombardier does have an expertise in building tramways. So why don't they go in that direction, which is the direction we need to go in. Then the other ones were kind of similar demands to what's in the 13, or in the kind of the stay grounded, but things around halt of airport expansions. We have several airports that are being expanded, and aerodromes in Quebec. And then also we have Indigenous communities in Canada that are dependent on flights to get to northern communities or isolated areas. So we also have something around that. And we're actually going to be we're reaching out to some of the Indigenous communities here to get feedback on how exactly we should word that demand, but they should be considered in terms of, if we are going to reduce air traffic, then we also have to take into consideration that some groups don't have any other options. So in the transition, that should be taken into consideration. So we put forward these demands, and then we just went to approach the civil society groups, and we managed actually to get a whole bunch of them on board. We thought maybe calling for a reduction in air traffic was going to be too radical for some groups, and it ends up that at this point in time, people are in agreement, and I think that's kind of partially due to the fact that the urgency of climate change in the last 8 months since the release of the IPCC report, or like last 10 months, in the media, it's just one bad story after another, and I think people are panicking. And I think that this type of message maybe a few years ago might have been seen as way too radical, but people are on board. So we actually, so I mentioned the groups earlier, but the university students are actually voting at their Congress this weekend. So we brought a proposal to them, and they're going to be voting on it at their student Congress. Le Pacte pour la Transition with the 290,000 mailing list is on board. The one with the civil society group is on board. And we're also reaching out to engineering student groups that work in aerospace and try and inform them and get them to come out and also in favor of a just transition. So there's kind of a bit of that groundwork, of just going to meet people and trying to pitch it to them, which has actually been going very well. I think when people see the information, they mostly didn't know anything about what's going on, of CORSIA, with the greenwashing of that ICAO was doing. People are very open to this idea. So our plan, though, is, so the coalition is coming together. I think even Greenpeace Canada this morning said that they were going to join as well. But our plan is on the 23rd of September, we're going to be, it's yet to be completely confirmed exactly when. So it might be the 23rd of September, but that's what we're aiming for. But we're going to come out with a press conference and materials for the press that were basic to put forward our demands. So basically a reduction in air traffic. And we're really going to hammer that message. We think it's absolutely necessary, and we think the focus on government intervention. So we're talking to, we want this to happen at ICAO, but our focus is going to be the Canadian government should have a position at ICAO that calls for air traffic reduction.
Yeah, thank you so much, Anthony, for this overview. And I think it's really a very promising sign that this huge coalition is forming right at ICAO headquarters to actually bring the protest right to the negotiations. And now is the moment to either chip in with ideas on how to link up with this protest in Montreal, or also to share from your groups what other ideas you have already planned. So a lot of interesting ideas on how to get active also in the longer run, not only until the ICAO Assembly happening from the 24th of September onwards. And thank you everyone for this inspiring discussion. I'm handing over to Lena now for some summarizing of our webinar.
Yes, just very shortly. So I think we learned some new things about sustainable alternative fuels, so-called, and biofuel use, about offsets and the problematic involved, about transparency issues, and about the threat also that CORSIA could become the only measure allowed for tackling international aviation emissions. Also, Christopher told us about the threat that China and Russia and maybe other powerful countries might boycott CORSIA, not because it's a justice and land grabbing issue, but because it might restrict growth of aviation. And I think there have been quite some different opinions about how to deal with CORSIA. So should we reform CORSIA to have stricter criteria, or not use certain offsets or biofuels, or rather stop CORSIA? So there are many questions involved with that. Does it mean that no international treaty would mean more growth? Or would it mean that no international treaty leads to less land grabbing through offsets and biofuels? Or would it mean that no international treaty would therefore trigger stronger action in some regions, but maybe less action in other regions? Should we, what should we call for? Or should we rather call or push the notion that we need to reduce air traffic, or maybe say reduce air traffic, not offset emissions or hope for technological solutions? So to always link this reduction of air traffic to also the false solutions. Yes, so quite diverse opinions. I think it was great that all of those were present here. We compiled some possibilities for actions. So what can we do? We can call on member states to raise critique or even reject CORSIA, and to warn that CORSIA could become the only possible measure for international aviation. So to warn member states that the protocols shouldn't be changed in terms of this. Then also influence at the European level, for example, at the chair of Transport Committee. And an idea was also to include offset projects into the EG Atlas and link this to air traffic. There was the call to support Montreal and the demands in Montreal internationally. So I guess Anthony will send around those demands, and we will be able to sign it with our organizations. We're happy to share this as Stay Grounded. Then also the idea to make journalists more aware of CORSIA and also of the transparency issues, that journalists aren't allowed to get into the discussion rooms. Then looking for experts and academics that openly reject offsetting in CORSIA. And then there was the idea to link up the different struggles taking place in the Climate Strike Week and point out with these actions also towards aviation and the ICAO conference, and maybe to show all of those also on the Stay Grounded media channels and website and press release. And then there were some ideas about nonviolent direct action at airports. So maybe this could also be an idea for another webinar to share different ideas for direct action. Yes, thanks from my side for joining. Yes, and goodbye.
Yeah, have a nice evening or day, depending on from where you have joined us. And thanks a lot.
Bye-bye.
Stay tuned and stay grounded.